welcome to the Microsoft Australia OEM team webinar for Windows Server for August 2016. So this is the first in the series for this new financial year, and obviously it's going to be quite an important year for us. We've got Windows Server 2016 details coming out around the launch activities, the timeframes, and we'll be covering those as we go through today. But the important thing here is that the event will be officially launched at the Ignite event in the United States in September of 2016. And then we'll have a series of local events as well as channel availability in the October 2016 timeframe. So we're really on that final countdown now. So it's time for us to really start digging into some of the specifics around what has changed with Windows Server 2016. And what we'll do in this two-part series of webinars is first of all, we'll talk about what's actually changing in terms of the licensing and the product packaging. So what SKU changes, etc., are there? Because these are some of the important things that are going to have an impact compared to some of the things you may have done with Windows Server in the past. Now, the other piece that's really important to understand here is the way that the licensing has changed in terms of moving from a per processor or per VM type approach to a per core approach. Now, obviously, things like the CALs, etc., are all going to be part of this conversation as well, but we won't cover that one today. Maybe we'll include that in next month's. But for this month, it's really, a big focus on the licensing, some of the changes, but also just to give you an understanding as to the reasons why you should still be looking at deploying Windows Server in your customer environments moving forward. Obviously, with the rapid rise of cloud technologies, there are always going to be questions around what do we keep on premises versus what do we move to the cloud. And we'll have some conversations about that as we go through the first two series in this recording. But then as we start digging into the additional technologies in depth over the coming months, that's where you'll see that for customers that have got large requirements for on-prem virtualization, etc., high-speed local file and storage, local Active Directory, these are obviously still very important things that on-premises solutions can provide for us. So here's the breakdown of what we'll cover. So we'll start off with some of the SMB server trends, just so you can get an understanding of what's happening in the market. We'll do an overview of Windows Server 2016. Then we'll talk about how to position Windows Server 2016. We'll talk about the SKUs, the different editions, and then we'll start covering some of the licensing in more detail, and then talk about some of the dates that you should be saving for the upcoming events that we've got. So let's jump in now and take a look at the technology trends. So the first technology trend that we'll talk about here is just some of the growth that's going on in here. So first up, globally, there's an $850 billion worldwide IT spend by SMBs that occurred last year, and they expect things like virtualization technologies to grow by 17% year over year. So we've got these huge growth areas, but also, and if you've joined these webinars before, you'll know that we do tend to focus heavily on the SMB side, that it talks about there being 125 million SMB organizations worldwide. But we know that in Australia, we're heavily represented by SMB organizations just due to our local economy. So obviously, a lot of what we're going to say here is going to apply very well across a very large percentage of Australian organizations. So as we take a look at the SMB landscape, we've got three different things that we can focus on here. So first off, the market trends. So as I mentioned, we've got this accelerating shift to the cloud. So this means that there are going to be situations where there are workloads that make more sense to run in the cloud. And for a typical SMB customer, we can, I can easily argue that why are you still running Exchange infrastructure for a handful of users, for example? Why not just use Office 365 and Exchange Online for that? Now, there are always going to be, outliers who do require certain things to stay on-prem, even if the rest of the world is moving cloud in those situations. So it's not saying that just because everyone else is doing it, that it's going to be right for you and every one of your customers. But to think that it's not right for anyone is just as incorrect as saying that it's absolutely essential for everyone. Now, other trends that we're seeing are things like expanding quantity of data. So we've all seen this. The storage requirements by our customers are increasing at an exponential rate. We're seeing hard drive sizes increase, but then we've got these additional challenges though when we start talking about expanding quantity of data. which is, well, what about backups? What happens to the backup window as the amount of data that we're updating, saving, churning starts increasing dramatically as well? Other trends that we're seeing, and I think this is something that's pretty well established now, is the mobility, things like bring your own device. We're at the point now where a lot of organizations are telling their users that, look, as long as it's got this level of mobile operating system on it, and you're happy for certain organizational policies to apply to it, then you can join it to our network. You can receive your email on it. You can use the Office 365 mobile apps on those to open up work-related documents, because we know that we can push down certain security and quality levels there. Now we're also seeing large demands for business analytics. So this is something where, regardless of the size of the organization, one of the challenges that has been in place for a very long time has been that a lot of organizations have got ridiculous amounts of data, but it's interpreting that data and trying to figure out, what to actually do with it. That's the challenge. So now, what are those business goals? So making sure that we meet high levels of customer satisfaction, that we've got operational and cost efficiency. Also, making sure that employees stay productive. For me, this is one of the things that I think is absolutely critical, where employee productivity is one of those things that just is overlooked by so many organizations, where, they'll invest heavily in technology, but without the appropriate user training or user education, it's really hard for people to really see the value there. And now the other piece here is managing risk. Now, with some customers, managing risk is a bigger issue for you, because if it's a risk-averse customer or a risk-averse industry, that they're not going to be people who live at the bleeding edge. So some of the conversations that you might have with some of your other customers about moving workloads to the cloud sooner rather than later, for some of those risk-averse customers, they may be saying, look, it's not what our industry is doing yet. We need to sit on the sidelines and wait until someone else that's large in our industry does that, and that pretty much signals the go-ahead for other organizations. Now, finally, as we move on to the IT needs. Now, in many cases, these IT needs are the needs that you are going to be providing for the customer, because a lot of the SMB customers don't have an IT department or a large enough IT department to really cover them effectively. So they depend heavily on you. So making sure that security and compliance requirements are being met, making sure that staff are aware of the new capabilities that are required, but also starting to really re-educate people around, who should have admin privileges, for example. So here, when we talk about some of the changes that are needed there. So how do we start just giving people on-demand access to the types of admin requirements that they've got, instead of finding that you've got 50 people in a 75-person organization who are running with enterprise admin rights? And maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you've probably got a customer out there where you've had to really wind back things like the enterprise admins and the domain admins membership. So how do we also go through optimize IT budgets? How do we improve IT agility? So a lot of these challenges aren't new, but I think the thing that kind of drives this the most is the first item here, which is the accelerating the shift to cloud services. So this is allowing a lot of partners to have customer conversations that really let you get an idea of what the future direction is going to be for that customer moving forward. So now let's move on to the next slide. So these days, organizations demand more from IT. If they're spending money on services, they expect to see more of a return on that. Nobody wants IT to be this black hole where money gets sunk into. So people want to make sure that they can really leverage what they've got. So some of the things here around, making sure that organizations have got a shared network. And even though these are US figures here, for the 52% of small businesses have got no server, okay, this is one of those things where those of us who've worked with Windows Server for a very long time period have, we've always, we know that once we put a Windows Server into even a very small organization, that once we can start leveraging things like Active Directory, the single sign-on type capabilities, we know that that's really the basis from which a lot of other things can start benefiting. And now, even if we are using cloud services, the ability to then have things like single username and password synchronization across to those cloud services is the type of thing that we can do very easily with Windows Server. Now, as I mentioned, we've got 17% annual growth of what SMBs are spending on server virtualization. Now, this is one of the things where, if you've heard me talk about server virtualization in the past, okay, one of the things that I always tell people is that, we need to be aware that just because we've been all in on virtualization for several years, it doesn't mean that every other customer or every partner out there in the market is. So, there are still a lot of situations where you walk in and it's like, well, why are these separate servers? Why aren't these things virtualized? Why aren't you looking at different ways of working? And, it may have been based on an objection that was raised 5 years ago that someone just thought it's too hard to try to address this again with a customer now. Let's just keep the status quo. But we're at the point now where, virtualization, it's not something that's approaching mainstream. It's definitely beyond mainstream at this point. So making sure that you do have the virtualization conversations with your customers, and obviously with Server 2016, virtualization is a huge part of this. So as we go through the next probably 6 to 12 months of updated webinars, you'll find that in one way or another, most of the things that we will tend to talk about can be tied back to enhancements in virtualization or the networking and storage capabilities underneath the operating system that enhance the virtualization technologies. Now, finally, we've got that change in infrastructure. So how do we become more efficient? How do we use cloud services? How do we decide what cloud services to use? And my approach on this one is quite a moderate one, which is if there are cloud services that make sense to use, you should use them. It's not a matter of saying everything has to go cloud or everything has to stay on premises. There are going to be different conversations you have to have with different customers here. But here they're talking about in the US that 78% of SMBs will be using cloud services within 4 years. Well, I think in some ways you could also think, well, depending on how you classify cloud services, it could already be higher than that. And this is one of those things where in Australia we've seen that there have been certain cloud services that customers have been incredibly quick to adopt. So things like online accounting and finance type applications. So there are some categories where customers have really moved ahead of with their line of business applications becoming available through cloud services, whereas they might still be a little bit reluctant in some other areas. So obviously these are important conversations to have with your customer. So let's jump in now and talk about some of the specifics around Windows Server 2016. So we've got a bit of time, so we've got a few things that we can go through in today's recording. So first up, if we take a look at the 3 key pillars that we'll cover in this section, we'll talk about safeguard your business. So this is making sure that there are inbuilt protections to make sure that you've got data being safeguarded across different devices, different apps, whether they're on-site, in the cloud. So different technologies that Microsoft is basically building in across the board in their technologies. Now, for the improved IT efficiency and productivity, making sure that your customers get the most out of their IT investment. So Microsoft making sure that even for SMB customers, they can get access to a lot of the technologies that larger organizations use without it necessarily being something that has to break the bank. And then the final piece, which is the cloud readiness, is planning today for something that is definitely going to enhance your customers' experience in the future, which is leveraging particular cloud services that make sense for them. So now let's dig into them in just a little bit more time, in a little bit more detail, so you can get more of an understanding around these. So the first one, when we come back to safeguard your business, is out of the box now. Microsoft has included the Windows Defender technology straight into Windows Server. So now Microsoft has got that same Defender technology that they've got across System Center, Windows on the desktop, Microsoft Intune is now also available as part of Windows Server. So this means that you've got protection from basically when you do that, pull down that first signature update, or you've got some protection out of box, but as soon as you get a connection and from WSUS or Windows Update, you can then get additional updates, definition updates from there. Now, one of the things that I did mention earlier was the ability to go through and start getting a lot smarter around how do we allow people to get access to certain resources in the organization. So important things here are the just enough and just in time administration. So, we really shouldn't be making people enterprise admins or domain admins a lot of the time, but sometimes we do it because we're short of time, we just need to do something quickly, we need to make sure that it works, but sometimes these things don't get undone. So things like the just enough and just in time administration are obviously important improvements here. We've also got the secure boot technology, so making sure that we've got additional protection to make sure that, even before the operating system loads, that we don't have any kind of interference with things like the bootloader, etc., as we're booting the system. So this relies on, ensuring that we've got the appropriate UEFI firmware installed or up to date and enabled on our servers. But this is something that if you've been using Windows on the desktop for years, this is something that you're already starting to become quite familiar with. Now, the final piece here is for organizations that do need to go through and really start saying, well, look, we want to go down the virtualization path, but we really want to make sure that someone can't just pick up our VMs, copy the VHDs, take them to another location, and then run them up and see what we've got. And this is where technologies like shielded virtual machines mean that we can't take those virtual machines out of our environment. So even though we can physically take the drives or the VHDs, these are all encrypted with technologies such as BitLocker, and unless it's part of that same network, you're not going to be able to go through and override that. So making sure that people have got additional layers of security across the network. Moving on to the second pillar, which is improving IT efficiency and productivity. So this is where we can start really leveraging technologies like virtual machines and containers. Now, the container story is probably the one that we'll have to spend the most time on in the coming months, because in the Windows world, it's a fairly new phenomenon, whereas in some of the other server platforms, containers have been used more heavily. But obviously, this is something that we will need to spend a bit of time on. We'll be covering it in detail at the launch events to make sure you've got an understanding of the different types of containers that Windows Server does support. But effectively, ways of isolating different workloads from each other, but without necessarily having to have the overhead of memory and disk, for example, that a full virtual machine may require. Now, we'll come back and talk about that over time, so don't worry if it's a new concept. We'll spend a lot more time on it in the future. So we've also still got technology such as the disaster recovery, we've got the cluster support, we've got the Hyper-V replica type capabilities in there. But depending on whether you're going for the standard or data center editions of Windows Server, this is where you'll also start seeing things such as the ability to start having your storage replica through storage spaces pushed out over wide area network connections, for example, in synchronous or asynchronous mode, depending on the performance. So as you move into data center, there will be some additional enhancements, and we'll talk about that because this was something that did change with Server 2012, but now it's effectively gone back to the pre-2012 model. There have also been enhancements to remote desktop services, so this will be something that we'll also focus on in much more detail in the future, as well as in our blog post series, so that you do get an understanding of what's new, what's changed, and more importantly, how your customers actually benefit from that. So now as we move into be ready for the cloud, okay, this is one of the things that some of you have probably already started working through some of the integration capabilities. So as we take a look through this, we've got enhanced mobility with virtual machines and containers. We've got the ability to start hooking more easily into different Azure services. So things like Azure Storage, Azure Backup, Azure Site Recovery, but other things, and for those of you who are already working with Office 365, you've probably already set up tools like DirSync or AAD Sync or AAD Connect to hook up to Azure Active Directory and things like Office 365 and Intune. The other thing there is that also remember that with Windows Server Essentials Edition, that you do also get that native capability to have that synchronization of usernames and password synchronization with the Azure Active Directory environment. Now, other things that you'll start seeing with this is additional management options. So enhancement to the on-premise administration tools, as well as cloud-based administration tools as well. So these are some of the things that we won't dig into in any detail today, but over time you'll start seeing that we've got these different ways that we can start doing simplified central server monitoring, server administration, etc., through a variety of different tools that Microsoft has made available. So now, as we take a look at what the top new features are in Windows Server 2016, we won't go through all of these in detail because obviously each of these is going to be quite a bit of content, but we'll just do it at a high level. So for Safeguard Your Business, the important things we covered. So the enhancements to granting the right level administration at the right time, the inclusion of Windows Defender for malware protection, making sure that you've got secure boot capabilities that have been on the desktop side for a while now, but leveraging these over on the server side. Now, the improved IT efficiency and productivity, this is where things like virtualization, containers, if you need clustering, if you need storage, replica, etc., these are things that will be provided there for you. And then for ready for the cloud, the important things there are obviously things such as the integration with Microsoft's Azure services, as well as the Azure remote management tools, which we haven't covered yet in any of our previous content, as well as integration with Microsoft's Operations Manager Suite, which again, it's a cloud-based service that we haven't covered in any detail whatsoever in previous recordings or articles, but it's something that I can spend a bit more time on now that we are approaching launch. So how do we position Windows Server 2016? Well, there are 5 key questions that we need to ask. So let's take a look. So why choose a server? Why choose Windows Server 2016? Which edition of Windows Server 2016 is right for you? Why choose on-premises software, and why choose OEM server licenses? So let's take a look at these. So let's start off with, why do SMBs choose to use a server? So really the main scenarios that we've got here, not all of them may apply to every single customer. Every customer has got some unique requirements. But things like sharing files and resources, your on-prem Active Directory, integration with cloud services for backup, etc., simplified management, a consistent experience, these are just some of the things that we've got here. But obviously, if we need things like remote desktop services, etc., these are things that for a lot of organizations, they'll continue to run on premises for an existing period of time. If we take a look at the different scenarios, some of the key scenarios that we see for SMB customers, we've got increasing server utilization with virtualization. Up until this point, we'll see more virtualization moving forward, but we'll also start to see the adoption of certain container capabilities in Windows Server as well. We've got the disaster recovery capabilities. So whether we're just talking about having Hyper-V virtual machines replicated from one location to another, or whether we're doing full-blown integration with the Azure Site Recovery Services. For organizations that want to invest in failover clustering, these are capabilities that are available as well. We've got some enhancements to the storage, which we'll talk about in some of the coming slides. We've got the hybrid cloud technologies, so where can we leverage Azure very easily? And then finally, we've still got the good old scenario of the first server. So organizations that may have survived for a server, or maybe using peer-to-peer services, not realizing that there are definitely going to be some benefits to them moving towards having their first server deployed. So first up, what's the server utilization and virtualization containers? What's the story around that? So this is something that we've seen in various forms over the years where, in the past, we may have had a user with, or a customer with a lot of different servers, each with a dedicated role. But when SMBs think about virtualization, they typically think about server consolidation. So enabling them to run more applications on fewer servers, helping to cut costs for hardware, maintenance, and an increasingly important one for a lot of organizations is getting that carbon footprint down, so reducing power consumption. But virtualization also delivers a range of other benefits, so it can make it dramatically faster and easier to start managing that environment. So regardless of whether your customer has got 2 servers or a room full of them, you can help them use virtualization to get the most out of their investment. And this is especially relevant if they've recently refreshed or are planning to refresh aging hardware, because obviously over time, the hardware capabilities as far as virtualization are concerned have improved quite drastically. So hardware that you may not have even considered virtualization on in the past, once it's cycled out, all of a sudden that virtualization conversation needs to be part of the conversation. So why would you sell virtualization solutions and services on the Microsoft platform versus one of the others? Well, probably the important thing there is Microsoft includes it with the operating system. When you deploy Windows Server 2016, you've deployed a virtualization platform for your customer. You've got Hyper-V built in, you've got Windows containers built in, and Windows Server 2016 makes it easy and cost-effective to develop, implement, and manage a server consolidation strategy for your customers, regardless of how big or small they are. Now, one of the major benefits of virtualizing your customer environments is that it eases the upgrade path by eliminating the pain typically associated with migrating servers. So once the services are hosted on virtual machines, it's simple to move the contents to new hardware. So if we need to move it from server A to server B, then obviously if it's a virtual machine, it's a very easy process for us to do that. And virtualization also creates a foothold for additional services in a range of other areas, such as, what are the disaster recovery options as well as the different storage plans the customer has got. So what's the value for partners here? So the ability for you to be able to go through and sell more VM licenses as needed as the customer starts deploying more and more virtual workloads, upselling the storage capacity, whether it's local storage or even in some cases it may be remote storage capacity on Azure. And then from the partner profitability perspective, obviously one of the very important pieces here is then providing the managed services on top of that. So whether we're talking about, data security to patch management to backup to recovery, etc., these are all things that for partners can be profitable parts of the business. So as we take a look at affordable disaster recovery, the things we can talk about here is that, there's there are always going to be natural disasters of one type or another in the news, and a lot of the time when we see those, being IT professionals, a lot of the time we sort of think, okay, what's the impact that would have if it was our customers in that location? Now, sometimes we're lucky and our customers aren't affected by these things, but we've seen a number of scenarios or situations in Australia over the last few years where Australian businesses and end users have been extremely impacted by different natural disasters that have occurred. So when we take a look at this, it may be natural disasters, but it may not be. Sometimes they can go down due to a power outage. It could be a break-in. It could be a fire. But it's incredibly important to make sure that systems are backed up, that they're protected, and you've got the ability to minimize the downtime if a catastrophe does occur. So how are the different ways you can do that? Well, we can talk about different cloud solutions. We could talk about using Hyper-V clusters, for example. It's really a matter of what's in the customer's requirements, but also what their budget's going to allow. Now, in the past, a lot of the disaster recovery solutions have been quite expensive to the typical SMB customer, but now this is something that Microsoft is including a lot of this functionality directly in the box. So obviously, if you want to leverage something like Azure Site Recovery Services, well, that's a subscription service that's on top of this. But just with things like your Hyper-V replica, with your clustering, these are things that are just available as part of your Windows Server purchase. So when we talk about Hyper-V Replica, well, that's a feature that's included with Windows Server 2016. It was introduced with Windows Server 2012, and it makes an initial replica of the entire virtual machine's virtual hard disk, and then continuously replicates any changes at intervals that you can establish across to a secondary server, or perhaps even a third server if required. And this is asynchronous replication, so it can deploy it on a standard broadband connection. So it means that you don't have to have dedicated high-speed connections. It's not a synchronous one that's going to time out if it doesn't get an update within a couple of seconds. This is something that's built to work across higher latency and lower speed connections. So for a lot of people, that's initially going to be a big benefit for them. So as a partner, what are the benefits that you can see through here? Well, again, there's a lot of additional services you can wrap around this. There may be additional hardware requirements that are needed to implement some of these. There might be, if you want to expand the disaster recovery scenarios that the customers can do, well, additional hardware requirements that meet those to make sure that they can actually do this in a cost-effective and time-effective manner. Now, as we said, you can either do this as a fully managed on-prem service, or alternatively, you could start looking at, well, how do we host this ourselves? Because you could have Hyper-V Replica pushing those virtual machine replicas into an environment of your choice, or you could have it replicating into Azure. So you've got a lot of flexibility there with what you can do. If we take a look at the specifics of high availability with failover clustering, well, what we've got here is a group of independent computers that work together, and what they do is increase the availability and scalability of the clustered roles. So The clustered servers are connected by physical cables and by the server operating system and the virtualization platform, etc. And if one or more of the cluster nodes fails, the others begin to provide that service. So in addition, the the clustered roles are proactively monitored. They verify that they're working properly, and when they're not working, they are restarted or moved across to another node. Now, Windows Server 2016 supports the construction of failover clusters with up to 64 physical nodes, but obviously that's going to be overkill for your typical SMB customer. I'm not saying it's not something that a couple of SMB customers globally may be using depending on their requirements. But to give you an idea, if you've got up to 64 physical nodes, you can have up to 8,000 concurrently running virtual machines on top of that cluster. So we're talking about something that does scale out incredibly well. So what you can also do with Server 2016, if you want to make sure that you're getting the best uptime, you've got the ability to implement rolling upgrades of the cluster. So this enables you to upgrade the cluster. If it's currently sitting at Server 2012 R2, you can do upgrades to Windows Server 2016 without stopping Hyper-V or the scale-out file server workloads. So this means that if you're sort of looking at situations where you don't want to break the customer's service level agreement requirements, well, this allows you to go through and start doing some of those things directly in place here. So when we take a look at the rolling upgrades that the cluster capabilities provide here, okay, basically it means that the clusters running the Hyper-V virtual machines and scale-out file services can be upgraded without that downtime. There are some cluster workloads such as SQL Server that might be unavailable during that time, and they talk about numbers of typically less than 5 minutes to allow that failover to occur. And it doesn't require any additional hardware, but obviously you can add additional cluster nodes temporarily to smaller clusters to make sure that they can occur in a more timely manner. Now, the cluster doesn't need to be stopped or started. A new cluster isn't required. It's just that the existing cluster is upgraded. And the existing cluster objects in Active Directory are also just reused there. Now, the upgrade process is reversible until the customer chooses the point of no return, at which point all of the nodes will basically be running Windows Server 2016. And this is something that has to be triggered manually. You need to run a PowerShell command that's update-cluster functional level, and but otherwise, people could continue to run in that mixed mode for quite a while. Now, this is something that's important for partners because for customers that say, look, we want some of the benefits that we hear about from the cloud, such as someone providing high availability, providing multiple copies of certain workloads, and this is something that allows customers to do this kind of thing in their own environments. But obviously there are going to be higher hardware and software costs associated with this. But from a partner perspective, it is a service revenue opportunity for you. And if your customers do require it, well, it's pretty simple. They do require it. One of the areas that's been receiving some very dramatic upgrades in Windows Server with the introduction of Windows Server 2012 was the storage subsystem. And in this case, with storage spaces, with storage pools, etc., you've got a lot of additional capabilities being brought in with Windows Server 2016. But let's talk about what's going on with with SMB customers in terms of their storage capabilities. So analysts such as Gartner have been showing that the average mid-sized customer has got approximately 110 servers, 80 to 90% of those are virtual, and they've got 50 to 60 terabytes of data storage across a variety of different devices, whether it's a file server, a NAS device, some kind of storage appliance. And this is one of the things that's starting to become a bit problematic for some organizations because the staff don't necessarily know how to make the most out of all of the different platforms they're using. Some of the platforms can be quite expensive to expand. So Microsoft's been working aggressively over the last 4 years or so to try to make it a lot easier for large organizations, right through to small organizations, to get better capabilities out of Windows Server through a variety of different storage technologies. So some of the things that we've got that we've mentioned briefly, so things like Azure Site Recovery and Backup, Azure Storage, these are things that we've been able to add into Windows Server previously, so not new to Windows Server 2016. But now with Windows Server 2016, we start getting things like storage spaces direct. So we can have very high performance, highly available storage systems just using inexpensive local storage. So if we want to use things like NVMe drives alongside our the drives that we've got hooked up to our disk array, for example, these are things that we can do very, very easily just using the built-in storage capabilities of Windows Server. So this means that we can start getting better performance, we can get higher capacity, but also higher reliability because we can have multiple copies of this being replicated across the network, across the multiple Hyper-V servers. So this is something that Microsoft is really working aggressively towards. So those of you who've been using storage spaces in the past, and this is like a cause I've been championing for a while, and I get to talk to a few of you who are using it. And those of you who I generally talk to who are using storage spaces absolutely love it. There are some areas where you're saying, oh, if it could do some of these things, well, some of those things you've been asking for are some of the things that have started to be introduced here. So stay tuned. This is obviously something we'll spend a lot more time on. I've got a server here that's got a couple of NVMe drives, etc., in it, so that we can actually, as we go through this series of recordings, give you a good idea of exactly how all of this works together. So now wrapping up, what's the value for partners here? So again, a lot of this is around what are the services you can work here. So regardless of whether the customer wants to work completely on-prem, whether they want on-prem with some cloud, you've got an option of going through and selling some new types of solutions, especially around storage that previous versions that the customer may have been using just couldn't deliver. So revisiting the topic of ready for the cloud. So some of the things here, if we talk about the benefits of cloud computing, well, standardization, efficiency, productivity, the continuous innovation, web scale. These are things that we can't always take advantage of in an on-prem environment. If we think about the traditional way we work with servers and operating systems and applications in our server environments, generally we do a major rollout and then there might be some incremental bits here and there, but generally we're talking about a 3 to 5 year life cycle in most cases before anything too major gets added to the network. Any of us who've been working with cloud technologies know that it flips this on its head, where we have to expect new capabilities on a very regular basis. And the challenge we can actually have here is trying to keep up with all the changes that have occurred. So this way we can start leveraging some of those cloud benefits. So we may not necessarily want to keep changing things in our on-prem environment, but we'll have the ability to leverage some of those different cloud technologies that will help us keep to date in other areas of the business. So while many small and mid-sized businesses are likely to transition to a lot of public cloud type technologies, there are some larger organizations that may be constrained by regulations, by contractual commitments, etc. Will keep might keep a high degree of on-prem technologies. So the important thing to take away from this, from my perspective, is it shouldn't be an on-prem or a cloud conversation. It needs to be a hybrid conversation. So going back to one of the things I've probably already said a couple of times as we've been recording this is pick and choose the workload or the destination for the workload that's right for the customer. So in some cases, it's going to be server, but make sure that the server operating system that you're choosing has got fantastic hooks into the cloud services that you think are going to be most appropriate for your customer as you move forward. So again, what are the value adds for partners? So the cloud services that you can add to this. So one of the things that I always like to go back to was when we did our many city roadshow back at the beginning of the year 2015 for Windows Server in the OEM team. It was amazing when we went to regions where they'd already had their broadband rollouts with the NBN. And what we were seeing there, and some of the feedback that I got in one location in particular, which really caught me off guard, was some of the partners that I was talking to there were giving the feedback that the biggest issue they had when NBN was rolled out was they didn't know how to take advantage of it. So they had customers who had all this bandwidth, they had all this capacity, and but they were still using their traditional systems. So obviously things like Office 365 may have been part of that conversation. But now we can start saying, well, what about Azure Site Recovery? What about cloud-based backup services? These are all things that we can very easily add into that conversation moving forward for customers who do have those types of connections. Now, last but not least in this section is investing in your first server. So those of you who've been involved in the Microsoft Server or Windows Server world for a while, the SBS world, will have probably heard variations of the first server, right server conversation for quite a long time period. And this is something that, even though most of the organizations we work with may already have a server, from an SMB perspective, as the stat that we had earlier, the 52% of small businesses in the US have no server. And I'm guessing in Australia, I don't know how much above or below that, but I'm guessing it's still a fairly high percentage in Australia, where things like peer-to-peer, etc., people might see those as appropriate options. But, some of the things that we list here, they're simplifying daily tasks, protecting critical business data with a cost-effective backup, the centralized management of users, antivirus, anti-malware, etc. But the one that for me is a very important one here is establishing that cloud-ready IT platform for the future. Now, I think for a lot of these customers that are already they're probably already cloud connected. They might already be using Office 365. They might already be using, other cloud services. And one of the things that I think we need to revisit in a future update, we'll talk about, what the benefits are, even for an incredibly small organization, of having their on-prem, let's even say, instead of, they're not even thinking of Windows Server, they're thinking about, a NAS device of some type. How do we say, well, instead of looking at a NAS device, how about if we take a look at Windows Server Essentials, for example? What are the benefits we start getting when we can integrate that with, very simply with Azure Active Directory? What does that mean in terms of a user's experience when they're coming onto the network for the first time or going out into the cloud and trying to access resources? So these are things that are incredibly important, and Microsoft's got an amazing story here with the integration of their on-prem Active Directory or Active Directory domain services with the Microsoft Azure Active Directory services as well. That's something that we'll cover in a lot more detail as we move forward, but this is something that I think is not necessarily a cloud-ready platform for the future. I think most SMB customers are probably already going to be in a situation where this is something that's going to provide immediate value for them. So let's jump in now and talk about one of the areas that we will be focusing on very heavily over the launch period, because there are some major changes here when we talk about the different editions and SKUs. So let's jump right in and talk about what these are. So first up, if we take a look at Essentials Edition, let's just say that for now it's not the focus. Assume that there will be some changes, but nothing too drastic. It's when we take a look at Standard and Data Center Edition that we really need to start focusing on some of the things that have changed here. So what you'll see here is that between Standard and Data Center Edition, there'll be similarities like there have always been, but then once we get to Data Center Edition, you'll start seeing that there are going to be some specific features that are only available in the Data Center Edition. So things like storage replica, things like storage spaces, direct technologies, a new networking stack that effectively is the Azure networking stack but brought down on-prem, as well as things like the shielded virtual machines and the host guardian service. So just let me spend a moment on these to position this so that you can get an understanding of whether or not these data center features are things that are important for you. So remember with Server 2012 and 2012 R2, the thing that would determine the standard versus data center decision was really around how many virtual machines are you going to be running. And there'd be a price point at which data center made a lot more sense than standard. Generally a lower number if you knew the customer was going to be adding virtual machines at a rapid rate. Now, as we take a look at Data Center Edition, as we look at the capabilities that are being listed here, if we're talking about your typical single server SMB customer environment, Data centers probably not going to be adding a lot of value there, unless the customer does have higher virtualization requirements, in which case they'll be able to leverage some of these additional features. But as soon as we start scaling out the number of servers, that's where things like the storage replica and storage spaces direct technology start kicking in. So with storage spaces direct, this is where we can start looking at things like hyper-converged Hyper-V environments where we've got the Hyper-V clusters set up without any shared storage. It's all local storage on all of the Hyper-V machines. Now, in order for this to really work effectively, you've got to make sure that you've got an incredibly high-speed backbone between the virtual machine, or sorry, between the Hyper-V servers. So we're starting to talk about some pretty expensive networking capabilities here because, we're not even necessarily talking about, we're not talking about gig Ethernet. We're not even really talking about 10 gig Ethernet here. In a lot of cases, you'll see the architecture requirements around this pointing towards things like RDMA adapters, for example. So really sort of pushing it up to be something that is going to require much higher end hardware, so probably going to be out of reach for the typical SMB customer. Now, the new networking stack feature for organizations that are already looking at how do we integrate with Microsoft's Azure virtual networks, then this is something that's going to make a lot of sense. But if the customer's just got a couple of branch offices, small branch offices and a head office, the additional networking capabilities here may not add a huge amount to their requirements. But when you start talking about an organization with lots of locations, lots of networks, lots of subnets that really wants to start managing all their virtual environment a lot more easily, then this basically gives you, computer-defined networking capabilities that align with the Azure technology. So for people who are going down that Azure path, that networking stack may make a big difference. But again, if it's a small organization, probably not so much. Now, the final one, the shielded virtual machines and host guardian service. So there is additional infrastructure that's required here to get all of these different technologies working. So when you're working, if it's just a smaller organization, that single approach, that approach of using shielded VMs to prevent you from moving those VMs, well, it's not something that's going to be available in standard. So you'll need to look at alternative ways to protect those virtual machines. And no doubt you'll see guidance. There's already recommendations out there around how you can do that. It's just not going to be something that's as well integrated into the operating system. Now, the final piece here, which we'll just mention briefly, is there still will be a storage server edition. And remember that this is something that comes pre-installed on NAS devices. So this is something that's not available through your OEM distributors. It's something that generally comes pre-installed on a device. And you can see here that there's a workgroup edition and a standard edition with wildly varying capabilities from a single proc and 32 gig of memory up to a dual proc system with 12 terabytes of memory. So just to do a quick summary of, as we've moved from Server 2012 to 2012 R2 to Windows Server 2016, what are some of the changes that have occurred here? So the asterisk there with Windows Server 2016, the important thing there is, this is including features that are in Data Center. So this is an all-up view. So what you'll see here in terms of the differences, we've got what we've added over time, the just enough admin, just in time, Defender being built in. We've got shielded virtual machines, the host guardian service, the Windows containers, storage spaces direct and storage replica, the enhanced clusters. So things like the rolling OS upgrades are really the major things. Now, obviously, this is just as it says, it's a key feature. It's not everything that's been made available or that's included. Instead, it's just a top line. Look, here's what's changed. So if someone's on Server 2012, for example, you'll see here that there's been quite a few changes. If someone's just rolled out Server 2012 R2, unless they specifically need some of these new features, it's going to be a harder sell to get them across the line to the new edition. So let's keep going now and talk about, well, why choose an on-premises server? So some of this is going to be pretty obvious to those of you who've been working with servers for a while, but probably the good part of this is that, now that you're probably having more and more conversations with customers around why cloud versus why on-premises, it's probably important to revisit some of these key topics. So first up, bandwidth constraints. So, Australia, like a lot of other countries, has got a a range of different broadband options available. But due to the size of Australia, we've probably all got customers in some locations that just don't have great bandwidth options available. So we really need to keep things centralized within the customer's office location. So obviously, that's not something that we can overcome until we know that we've got better bandwidth options available. Now, even though we're always seeing new updates around, whether it's new satellite or new regions in Australia where NBN is being rolled out, it's not something that's instantly going to fix some of the issues that all of you, that some of your customers have got today. Now, other things here that for some customers, they just like the idea of, of fixed amounts that they know I've paid for this. I like the idea that it's a longer update cycle. I want things to stay the same for an extended time period. You've got customers who like, as I said, they like to pay for things. They don't, some people love subscriptions. Some people love the idea of moving things over to a subscription model versus a purchase model, but there are other customers who like things the other way. There'll be some legacy applications that can't be migrated to the cloud. So there might be something where it might not be technically able to move to the cloud. It may have some certain hardware requirements, or it may be from a licensing or even a support perspective that the vendor may be happy to support the older version, but they may not be happy to support it running in a virtualized environment, which it would have to be, in most cases, in a public cloud environment. And other ones that do still come up occasionally, things like, regulatory compliance or data sovereignty requirements. So here it says that data must be secured on premises, but most of the time it's not necessarily an on premises. It's, it may be, a data center within your geographic region, for example. But sometimes there'll be, you might hit something that is a little bit more specific than usual. And the big benefit here with Microsoft versus a lot of the other vendors out there is, okay, Microsoft will let you do cloud. They'll let you do on-prem. It's really a matter of, what makes the most sense for the customer. So how do we address the cloud questions? So avoiding the one-size-fits-all answers to complex questions. So let's take a look at some of these. So the CEO said so is a cloud strategy, and sometimes it might be the the CEO says yes, it might be the CEO says no. So again, identify what it is that you're trying to do, and make sure that it's the conversation highlights the risks as well as the rewards. Conversations such as, you have to be cloud to be good. So in some cases, people's strategy is cloud, and you're like, well, what are you trying to get out of it? So making sure that, people have an understanding of, again, that, cloud isn't a universal answer to everything, but, it's something that can work well alongside what you're doing. The next one ties into this as well, which is cloud should be used for everything. And this is something that I think there would be, depending on the organization, depending on the partner, depending on the application that's in use, etc. This is something with a lot of gray area versus what's purely black and white. And cloud is always about money. So, someone says, well, is it necessarily going to be cheaper to run it in the cloud? Well, there'll be some areas where the cloud provides benefits for some customers. There'll be some scenarios where some of the savings may not be as obvious for customers. And then the final one is, cloud equals data center. So, just because someone's adopting cloud technologies doesn't mean they shut down their data center. And by data center, we could just mean, your dedicated, the rack that the customer's got that's got the comms equipment and the server in it, through to data center could be potentially something much, much larger for a large organization. So now let's move on to the licensing piece. So why choose an OEM server license? So why choose an OEM server license? Let's take a look. So it's the simplest, most cost-effective way. So you buy it, it's included with the server. You've got things such as, if you're buying things like ROK or pre-install, knowing that it's been pre-tested, it's been optimized by the OEM, and that that it's something that they've got the ability to support quite easily. It's a one-stop shop, so you can buy the hardware, OS, and CALs, get them all in one transaction through the distributor quite easily. You get the same downgrade and virtual machine portability rights as with volume licensing. So remembering that here we're talking about virtual machine portability rights. We're not talking about the general base OS licensing mobility rights. And Then we also do have license reassignment to other server hardware, but that's only with certain license types or if you put software assurance on the OEM purchase. So this is something that we've covered in detail in several posts and webinars in the past, but if it's something that you do have more questions on, we've got the contact details at the end of this presentation, so stay tuned and we'll get those, you can get those there. So now, what about debunking myths? So you cannot do virtualization with OEM server. Well, obviously you can, so we can cover that one easily. Because OEM licenses are tied to the hardware, VMs can't be moved between servers. Now, this is what I was alluding to in the last slide, which is while the base or the host OS is generally tied to the hardware, the VMs can be moved to other properly licensed servers. So if you've got two copies of Windows Server Standard running on two different physical Windows servers, you can move the virtual machines back and forth between them as long as you're not running more than the two VMs that those copies of Windows Server are licensed for. Now, obviously, if you're in a data center environment, Windows Server data center environment, you've got much more flexibility because you don't really need to track the number of VMs running per server. But just be aware of that because that's a bit of misinformation that always pops up. It seems to die for a while, but then it does pop up again. OEM licenses never come with reassignment rights. Well, as I mentioned, with Windows Server 2012 R2, there was an introduction of a Windows Server 2012 R2 data center with reassignment rights. But now what you'll see here is that there'll be a Windows Server 2016 standard with additional license reassignment rights. So this is something that we've covered the license reassignment rights in previous blogs, in previous webinars. So if you do need information on this, feel free to contact us on the contact details right at the end, and I'll make sure that you get access to that information. So what these special SKUs give you is effectively the same reassignment rights that you do get through volume licensing. So if you've been buying through volume licensing to get reassignment rights, then this OEM license type will also give you those. But it doesn't apply to every OEM license that's out there. The trick when it comes to OEM licenses and downgrade rights is that even though the users are given the right to downgrade, what's important to note here is that the customer has to provide the media. So they need to have the media from an earlier server, for example, that they might have. Whereas if they're buying it through volume license, they can go to the volume license server center and download whatever whatever editions are there that they're licensed for, including the downgraded versions. But with the OEM license, they basically do need to be able to provide the media and the product key for that. Microsoft does not provide those. And the final bit, which I've already covered, which is software assurance is not available with OEM licenses, but you can attach software assurance to an OEM license within 90 days of purchase. And effectively what that gives you from the usage rights of that server OS is, think of it as effectively converting it into a volume license plus software assurance purchase, but you get the benefit of the lower price of OEM server versus volume license server. Again, if these are things that you're not that familiar with and you're unsure, please contact us on the email address at the end of the presentation and we can point out the resources or cover any specific questions you've got. So what are the 6 things you should tell your customers? So if we take a look, so it addresses many of the technology issues facing SMBs today and positions them well for future growth. So like when any new version of Windows Server or I guess a new version of anything comes out, one of the conversations that you'll probably be having with customers for an extended time period is, well, even if we're buying Server 2016, should we deploy an earlier version because that's what the customer's used to? Like, I'm a big fan of, especially now with things like virtualization technologies, etc., is even if you want to run your key workloads on the previous version of the operating system as needed, or as makes you feel comfortable, run the host on the latest version. Get the benefits of the latest enhancements to storage, to Hyper-V, to the networking, etc. On-premises versus cloud is a decision that it's not necessarily a difficult conversation, but just make it something where you present both sides and make it something that's applicable to the customer. Now, understand with point 3 that Data Center does introduce some new features around virtual machine security and advanced storage and networking that aren't available with the standard edition. And we'll, as I mentioned, we'll cover those in a lot more detail over the coming months. And for number 4, for a lot of customers, an OEM license is the most cost-effective way to purchase the pre-tested software drivers, etc., because they can get it through ROK, they can get it through pre-install. Now, number 5, they've both got license reassignment right options available. It's not saying that it's included with all of the SKUs. You'll find that some SKUs do have it, some SKUs don't have it. And as you can probably expect, the SKUs that do have it, there is a price premium for those. So check your distributor price lists once Server 2016 goes on, and you'll get an idea of what's there. And even though we haven't covered it here, there really haven't been too many changes in terms of the CAL requirements for standard and data center. That's something that I'll put, because we've already got a lot of content in this month's update, I'll introduce this in more detail in next one, even though it should be revision for most of you. So what are the changes to the licensing model that we've now got with Windows Server 2016 Standard and Data Center? So this is really important because it is a major change from 2012 and 2012 R2. So now it's based on cores. So if we take a look at this, we've got, a few things that we need to think about. But if we talk about the new licensing principles, the important things here that the feedback that's coming through is that customers have got increasingly demanding environments where they are looking more and more at hybrid environments where they want something that might span on-prem and cloud. They want the ability to easily move back and forth between the two. This new licensing model reflects the need to enable portability in apps by creating a common currency for computing. So in Microsoft's world, this means that you're dealing with cores from a licensing perspective in the on-prem product, as well as in Azure, for example. And it also means that it more accurately reflects the evolution of hardware technology. So this is one of the things where licensing based on physical socket kind of worked for a while, but as we start seeing higher and higher density CPUs out there, in Xeon range especially, this is where the ability to sort of change it. So because a quad socket server from 5 years ago isn't going to compete very well at all against a lot of the dual proc systems that are available today if they've got a much higher core count, for example, as well as the additional enhancements that you've got in the underlying server hardware structure. So what we end up with is that core-based licensing provides a more consistent licensing metric regardless of where the solution is deployed. So regardless of whether it's an on-premises deployment or a cloud-based deployment. Now, the way that the licensing works is that you have to license for a minimum of 8 cores per physical processor and a minimum of 16 cores total. So this means that even if you're just buying a single server with 8 cores or less, you're actually licensing for 16. But a lot of the time people start thinking, does that mean I'm paying for all these cores that I'm not using? But hold out on that until we get to some of the calculations that you'll see soon. So you can get an idea of where price changes do actually start kicking in. So you can get an understanding of whether it actually does have an impact on your customers at all. And then the final thing here is that the standard edition still provides the rights for up to 2 virtual operating systems or Hyper-V containers when all of the physical cores in the server are licensed. And as you've been able to do in the past, you can then start assigning multiple licenses to the same cores for additional operating system environments or Hyper-V containers. So if you want 2 additional VMs, then all you have to do is, relicense all of the cores again. So in a lot of cases, it really doesn't change that much from what you've been doing in the past. It's just presented differently. So let's take a look at that. So the licensing of standard and data center has been enhanced. So if we take a look at this, what are the 3 licensing rules that we need to follow? So first up, license all of the physical cores on the server. Ensure that every processor is licensed to cover a minimum of 8 cores, and ensure that every server is licensed to cover a minimum of 16 cores. And this is something that effectively does take place. So let's take a look at some scenarios now. So first up, if the customer wants to license one physical server with 2 processors, each with 4 cores, well, then even though the 4 cores a processor doesn't meet the minimum license requirements, what you'll see as we go into the next slide is that it's not something where you start thinking, well, what's the impact? So I don't think this slide presents it very well, but it's still worth going through. Now, the next point is one physical server with one processor with 8 cores. So here you can see that we've got the minimum of 16 cores per server, but the server does not meet the minimum cores per server requirement. So we've got 8 cores each. And now the final piece is we've got one physical server with 2 processors with 12 cores each. Now, this is the one that's a bit different because the other two, you'll see that with standard licensing, number 1 and number 2 are going to be covered with effectively a replacement SKU for what you've been selling with standard in the past. But once we take a look at number 3, what you can see here is that we've got one physical server with 2 processors. So the base license, if it covers 2 processors, well, we're covered from the processor perspective, but we're not covered from the core perspective. So we need additional core licenses to cover those. So let's take a look at that. So every time you get a copy of, so for each time you license the cores, you're licensed for 2 VMs. So this is with standard. Obviously with data center, it's a different calculation. But because standard is the volume product that is shipped through the OEM channel, we'll focus on this one for now and visit data center in the future if needed. So here if we see if the physical server is fully licensed, then all cores are licensed, so that's 2 VMs. If the customer wants 2 more VMs, then they need to license that again. Now, if they want more VM, they want 1 more VM, well, effectively here for 1 more VM, it's the same as relicensing the cores for 2 VMs because you're effectively relicensing for 2 virtual machines at a time. Now, the comparison there is if you think about stacking Windows Server Standard 2012 or 2012 R2. For each one that you stack, you got an additional 2. You couldn't stack an additional 1. So let's take a look now at the cost comparison. So how does it compare? And in this case, what you'll see here is I've just used some round numbers to make the calculations easier for you to take a look at. If you need official pricing, contact your distributor. This is not to suggest or indicate what pricing is on these because it's going to vary depending on the channel, the vendor that may be selling it, whether there are any promos in market. So, a lot of disclaimers around including something that appears to be pricing. So this is just indicative. It is not real pricing. But if we take a look here, the important things to understand is that as we go from 1 proc through to 4 procs there with the 8 cores, you'll see that there's no change there in terms of what the pricing is. So if we think about the typical SMB environment being 1 proc or a 2 proc environment, then as long as we've got servers with 8 cores or less, and remember these are 8 cores, ignoring any kind of hyper-threading type technology. So this is actual physical cores. So if it's hyper-threading doubles the number of apparent cores, well, that's not the number we're working at. We're talking about the actual number of cores. So if you've got a customer here so let's assume dual proc system with that goes up to 8 cores per server, well, we're licensed with that would give us 16 cores. So that means that we're actually still covered. So what we need to start thinking about from that case is, once we go above 8 core servers, that's where we need to start thinking about what the impact is going to be. And as you take a look at the bottom, at the final option in that chart where we've got 4 processors with 10 cores per processor, then you'll see here that that's where all of a sudden we do start to see a price jump. So what you can see here, and then as you move across to the right-hand side, and we see the number of cores to be licensed for 4 VMs, you'll see in that highlighted section that it's really when we start going to higher density situations. So that's where we need to start thinking about, well, what's the impact they're going to be? But for the typical environment, it's probably not something that's going to really make a change at all. But just to reiterate there, if we take a look at probably the line above where that green line starts, so the 32, even if like a dual proc server with 4 VMs running on it, as long as each of the procs have got 8 cores or less, we're still paying the same price for Server 2016 versus what we paid for Server 2012 R2. Now, this is something where you'll see pricing calculators and things like that released in the future. Like I've got one that I use that I don't think we're allowed to make public just yet, but obviously as soon as it is, we'll make that available because I think this is an area that there'll be a lot of, first of all, a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstanding, but probably also a lot of fear mongering as well. So making sure that we get the right information out here is absolutely critical. So if we take a look now at the upcoming events, what we've got here is the Windows Server 2016 launch roadshow, which is coming up in October. So you'll notice we don't have registration details yet, but these are the planned dates so far. So this is coming sooner rather than later, but this will coincide with the US announcement will have already been made, and we should have stock availability at this point, which means that you'll be able to go to the price lists. We'll be able to hopefully be able to show you those pricing calculators, share them with you, so you can really get a good understanding of, for most of the purchases, if it's 8 cores or less per server, or sorry, per physical core, then the customers are actually, you're not looking at any price difference there. So the other events that are coming up, so probably the first one is the Australian Partner Conference. So this is coming up on the 5th to the 8th of September on the Gold Coast. We've got Ignite Australia 2017, so there'll be a lot of Windows Server 2016 technical content at this event, whereas the Partner Conference is more of a sales and marketing and more of just a product update in general, not really any deep dives into the technologies. And there'll be people like myself and others from the OEM team who should be at these events. So if you are heading along, reach out to us on the contact details that we've got on the next slide. So that brings us to the last slide for today. So what resources are available? So we've got smarthq.com.au, we've got the Australian OEM team blog site, which I regularly will be putting updates, new information, trying to clear up any topics that seem to be not well understood. And as we've gone through this recording, I've constantly said, we've got contact details. So we've got the pre-sales information for the OEM server product. So OEM Server au@microsoft.com. So if you've got pre-sales technical questions, if you've got OEM licensing questions on these products, please reach out to us there, and we'll make sure that we can get that information out to you in as short a time frame as possible. But what I'd like to do is thank you for joining us. This has been a longer than usual recording, but I think now that we've got more information on Server 2016 and there's more we can talk about, moving forward, you'll find that we've got a lot of information that we need to share. So the blog, Smart HQ, and these webinars will be the way that we get that information out to you. So thank you very much for joining, and I look forward to hearing from you and seeing you at some of the events we've got coming up.